entity. Oh.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Antoine Sargent, Director of Gagosian Gallery. We're delighted to welcome you today for a conversation with David Adjaye, Rick Lowe, that's moderated by Thelma Golden, on the occasion of Social Works, which opens tomorrow, Thursday, June 24th from 4 to 8. I hope you will join us. To introduce our speaker today, we'll start with David Adjaye, who is a Ghanaian British architect who has received international acclaim for his impact on the field. In 2000, he founded Adjaye Associates, which today operates globally with studios in Accra, London, and New York, and projects spanning the globe. Adjaye's largest project to date, the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., opened on the National Mall in 2016. And was named Cultural Event of the Year by the New York Times. Most recently, Adjaye was announced a winner of the 2021 Rebel Royal Gold Medal, and he also is the architect of the new Studio Museum in Harlem. Rick Lowe is a Houston-based artist and professor at the University of Houston. He has exhibited and worked with communities nationally and internationally. His work has appeared in the Contemporary Arts Museum Houston, Museum of Contemporary Arts Los Angeles, the Gwangju Biennial in Korea, the Venice Architecture Biennial, and Documenta 14 in Kassel, Germany. In 1993, he founded Project Row Houses, a community-based art project that he started in Houston. Additionally, he has done community projects which include Watts House projects in Los Angeles and the Barrow Project in Charleston, South Carolina. He has served as a Loeb Fellow at Harvard University, a Mel King Fellow at MIT, and as the Stanford University Haas Center Distinguished Visitor. President Obama appointed Rick Lowe to the National Council on the Arts in 2013. And in 2014, he was named MacArthur Fellow. And moderating our conversation today is Thelma Golden, the Director and Chief Curator of Studio Museum in Harlem, where she began her career in 1987 before joining the Whitney Museum of American Art. She returned to the Studio Museum in 2000 as the Deputy Director for Exhibitions and Programs, and was named Director and Chief Curator in 2005. Golden was appointed to the Committee for the Presentation of the White House by President Obama, and in 2015 joined the Barack Obama Foundation Board of Directors. Golden was a recipient of the 2016 Audrey Ermis Award for Curatorial Excellence. I would like to welcome you. I know that everyone has lots to do today, and so thanks for taking an hour of your time to engage in this wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Antoine. Hello, David. Hello, Rick. It is so fantastic to be with you here today. And I'm so excited for our conversation to talk about your work, the context of this work in this exhibition, as well as the many ways that I think your practices share a dialogue. But first, I want to congratulate Antoine on this fantastic exhibition and really celebrate this incredible constellation of artists having a conversation cross-media, cross-generation, and thinking deeply about this concept of Black space, Black practice, and these ideas. So, congratulations. So first, I'd love for both of you to talk about the work in this exhibition. And I'd like to start with you, Rick, as we are sitting here in the midst of these spectacular paintings. Can you tell us a bit about this body of work and very particularly the context from which this body comes?
Yes. Well, I guess it was about a little over 3 years ago, I was invited to Tulsa to work with the 1921 Tulsa Massacre Commission to bring in a kind of a cultural component to the centennial. And so I visited for the first time with an awareness of this, of this massacre. But what was interesting about it for me was there's the Tulsa Massacre that happened in Greenwood, but then there was this whole kind of spirit of that neighborhood that they call Black Wall Street. And so I left with this notion of thinking like, wow, Black Wall Street. I mean, that speaks to something that has been like something that's relevant to Black people in America since emancipation, trying to figure out, how do we solidify or gain some footing in terms of a stable economy in America. And so that took me on this journey of, trying to figure it out and think about it. And so the paintings were a way for me to, while on the one hand, I was working on a community-based project in Tulsa for the centennial, but on the other hand, the paintings were an opportunity for me to be reflective and to kind of a little bit critical in some ways, and to just, kind of imagine this idea of Black Wall Street and what that space looked like.
Mm-hmm. How did you make these paintings, Rick? Can you talk a bit about your process?
Yeah, well, these paintings come out of, most of my work started when I was trained as a painter early on and got away from it for many years and came back through this very odd way of just playing dominoes and watching the patterns of what happens when you play a game of dominoes. And I started to draw them and, and game after game, and you layer them, and all of a sudden they start looking like maps. And then when you draw them out and you cut them up, then they start looking like some kind of language, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, so these paintings are basically, they're collaged. From drawings of domino games that I've produced in the studio, and then I just go back and I cut them up and I start reorganizing them and making the forms.
Fantastic. David, this exhibition includes your first standalone sculpture. Can you talk about this path to making sculpture? And can you also talk about the references for the work and even its title?
Oh. Thank you, Thelma. Yeah, it's called Asaase, and for me, it's really a kind of reflection of the past 2 years, really. But really, it's about my entire career, probably my entire life. But it's really, I think the last 2 years have really sort of caused a sort of deep introspection. And when Antoine sort of reached out to me, the first thing that I really wanted to do was to make a work. And so the timing seems sort of perfect. For me, it's really about, I started at an art school. I didn't finish. I dropped out. I dropped out of art school because I was scared. So, it's like, oh no. So, and then I chose architecture because I was a profession I felt like I could, be in. And I love, and architecture is my soul. But I've always been fascinated by sculpture. And so, in a weird way, this pause has allowed me to just really reflect on why I'm not doing that and why it's not part of the practice. And then, as I said, Antoine brought it back. But I've become, especially in this last sort of 5 years, very interested in our sort of relationship to the earth. Of course, there are issues to do with the climate emergency and sustainability, but it's not really that. I think it's much more anthropological and it's a biographical in a way. It's really a kind of return for me to really think about the architecture of the continent, really, and this idea of this kind of extraordinary monolithic architecture that really just came from the earth. It was about raising the earth, and one that kind of created a kind of symbiotic relationship, a sort of with earth matter, and then with the plant life, the biophilic life. And somehow that has always been Black life. It's always been Black life. The roots of all of our ancestors, the one thing that can commonly touch. Until the Industrial Revolution and colonial kind of products, we lived with the earth. So I sort of feel like that's a kind of deep memory in Black psyche somehow, a sort of deep love. And so, and for me, there are two sort of inventions in the architecture. There's cylinders and there are rectangles and squares. So it's courts and chambers. It's kind of amazing, and they mutate into many forms. But I just wanted to deal with the cylinders. When I did my show in Venice, when I was working on this idea of the show, I kind of made these negative cylinders deliberately, and it was a sort of render of Earth, and I brought that from Ghana to Venice, and it was this idea of just really talking about being back to the Earth. And so in this show, which is not an exhibition space, but as a piece of work, I wanted to make not the negative, but the positive anyway. So these are fragments of different scale chambers that refer to chieftain's house, a king's house, a residence of a queen or a mother, a sculpture porch, a granary silo. It's really, in a way, a series of fragments that just then are sort of randomly thrown, almost like dominoes, if like you could scale it, thrown together and just adjust it so that you can meander through. And the idea is that you're meandering through walls that are about the relationship that we have to what walls, earth walls are, in terms of conversations, whispers, et cetera, et cetera. But this is made not from soil from the continent, because I wanted to suddenly really think about the soil of the entire planet, really. So this is made from New York sort of rock, because there's not much soil here.
Right. Yeah.
It's really limestone and schist rock. So I became fascinated, well, let's just crush the limestone and ram it the same way that, black architects did it.
Yeah.
And so that's what we did.
That's fantastic.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Can I say?
Yes, of course you can.
David and I spent time in Tulsa, kind of talking about how he could be involved there. And one of the things he talked about was that they need to go to the dirt here. It needs to go into the dirt. And so I was so blown away to see this piece, because this is what it is. You went to the earth and brought it up and gave us form. That's one of the things I think that Tulsa, that we're gonna get them around to it.
Rick and I have been trying to do a project together for, I think, nearly 2 decades. And I think it's coming to that point where
it's gonna happen.
It will happen. It will happen. Because as I said, there's so much shared, right, between your practices. Yeah. It seems to me very specifically that both of your works in this exhibition are about mapping. And if we think about mapping, right, up against this idea of space, it seems that it's a way of creating a logic, right? A visual logic, perhaps an intellectual logic, even a political logic, right? To understand place and space. So Rick, can you talk about the relationship of your work to place?
Yeah.
As these works are talking in some ways about place and space.
Yeah, I always think that one of the big challenges that we have as, Black people is, so interesting. Space is very important to us. We came out of a place, particularly here in America, of not having space and place that we could call our own, and we've been on this journey forever, from the days of the promise of 40 acres and a mule to now. Gentrification, there's just always, these things that are kind of blocking or curtailing our efforts to find space that we can find some kind of stability in. And and so when I'm working on these kind of works, for me, I'm trying to play around with all the knowledge that I've gained over the last 20 plus years of working within space, trying to identify how we build space that support Black communities and Black culture. And also wrestling with the difficulties of it, and trying to find the language, to describe it. And that's why I was so, a lot of, with this work, some of it, I'm just exploring, right? And I didn't know that if I do these domino paintings and cut them up, that they would look like letters, some kind of language. And so as I started to do that, then I've started to approach it in the same way that I'm struggling to understand what's behind gentrification and how do we fit within it and how do we respond to it. As I'm making these paintings, trying to figure out, how does this language, how does it speak within the paintings about this? So it's an interesting, I just find that this notion of space is something that we just have to really start generating more information about it, so we can gain deeper understandings of it.
And David, as an architect, your work has always been about a kind of creation of space, but also very much about a definition of place. Can you talk about that sort of collision between place and space as it informs your architectural practice and therefore perhaps inform the creating of this sculpture?
Place and space. I feel like I'm in a sun ra.
Well, space is the place. But you know, I mean, David, of course, you know, in the thinking about the Studio Museum, we talked a lot about space, right? Because what we are doing is building a space, but we talked also about place. Because, you know, as I've often said, in our name, it's there, right? It's a Studio Museum in Harlem. So place, right, and space. So I'm curious for you, Jess, to consider that, because again, I see this as the place in which you and Rick converge in a set of ideas that I think, as you know, Rick has so beautifully said, stand at the core of our thinking about a kind of Black experience, right? It's reckoning with both of those things, the longing for it, nostalgia, the lack of, the ways in which both are invested with ideas of value, right? So if we put that in the middle of it. So I'm just curious for you to meditate.
I love it, and I'm really listening because I'm actually, this is really happening live, where I'm really loving the way in which you're putting the two bodies of work together, because, and it's powerful. And you know, when I came and I first saw the paintings, I was just gripped by this kind of, this nebulous mapping of a kind of world. It almost as though it does exist, but you know, it's sort of like, but they're these kind of almost like coordinates that you're creating of different junctions and different kind of spaces of, you know, the sacred, the collision, the public. I don't know, it's my mind, so I go off whenever I'm looking at it. So I just thought it was really amazing that you're saying that. But going back to what Thelma's saying, I mean, space, and for me, the cataloging of space, cataloging and mapping, or using either words, is so fundamentally important to the Black experience, because in a sense, really, colonization was about erasure of the space, because when you erase the history of the space, you erase the sense of continuity of the community to the earth. And so, you know, in my work, you know, we are continually searching for, you know, spaces that are not necessarily even built by the Black community, but inhabited and hybridized by the Black community, as you know, spaces of ownership that become part of the hybridized catalog of the kind of the sort of body of knowledge, if I can call it the body of knowledge of spatial Black experience. And you know, I see myself in the work that I'm producing as an architect, and why I'm so interested in architecture is because it's, for me, stands against a void of erasure that's just so loud and so so absolutely enormous, that I just think it's almost like there's a, you know, it's kind of really depresses me when I reflect on it, but this idea of a kind of, we must redress this erasure. You know, I'm always talking to young Black architects, you know, architecture is so profoundly important, you know, that we have more architects of color in the world now, because we need to remake the body of knowledge.
That's right. That's right.
And we need to make the cartography of knowledge and document it. And we need to make the models of knowledge so that you know, future generations don't have this nonsense that we're dealing with, you know, because it's like a distracting trauma that is just, you know, around. So in a way, for me, the architecture that I'm interested in, and why I'm interested in working, you know, some people like to work in one town or something, and all practices are fine, but I was very interested when I had the opportunity to work, you know, with freedom across the planet.
Right. Right.
So this idea of a Black spatial form maker being able to work across the planet was just, for me, conceptually, what I felt it had to be. As somebody who's been given this opportunity, I've been able to kind of maneuver to get this opportunity. So I didn't want it to be that you only found my work in Black neighborhoods, but it's in India. It's in, you know, it's overwhelmingly clear that it's part of understanding the world. It's not just in one space.
Right. Right.
So,
well, you know, actually, and it is really, I think your formulation of space and place is really important, though, too,
powerful.
right? Because you know, space is, I mean, you know, it is.
Guiding principle of all of my work, right? Space and place. That's, you know, it's about making both.
Yeah.
So good.
exemplifying both,
So
existing
good.
within both,
Yeah. That's right.
understanding the relationship to both, its
Yeah.
space and its place.
So
And and the thing is, that they both have a kind of there's knowledge and language and information about both of those that make them really rich, right? And I think that we for the most part, we kind of space. We can kind of do space. We can, but place. Because place gets, space to me gets to be this more physiological thing, but place you get sociological. It gets into these webs of things that that I think we don't quite know how to handle it. Even like as I said earlier about the issue of gentrification. I mean, there's so many things about place that confuses that, right? Because Harlem, for instance,
Yeah.
right? I mean, okay, so it's moving, but are there wealthier black people moving into Harlem as well? I mean, or there whatever, I mean, so often, we think of
It's mixed.
gentrification, and people get, and then I just remember thinking this in my neighborhood in 3rd Ward, oh, gentrification is happening, but then I start meeting like, oh, wow, but you just moved here, as an African-American person, right?
Yeah.
It's like, so things change, but we don't have language to be able to talk about what it means when things transform.
Right.
When space transform, we don't understand the broadness of the place of that, which means that, does it mean that black space has to be space that is impoverished?
Absolutely.
Does it?
No.
Yeah, right. I mean, can it mean that we can, we can exist within this duality of the Black Wall Street?
Right.
I mean, in a way that, some place like Greenwood in Tulsa, it was a place of hardworking, honest people, but they had a sense of understanding of prosperity.
Totally.
And they desired that, and they wanted that. And
right.
black people wanted that.
That's right.
That's why they went there.
That's right.
So,
I love that.
so it's just, it's more complicated, and we just haven't been able to dig through to.
Well, this is the problem when you don't have a sort of body of knowledge or a kind of history of knowledge of that idea of space and place, that you start to kind of work within the limits of what you see as the only sort of possibility of ownership, and you start to clasp onto things that are sometimes actually not the things that
That's right.
are about the expansion, and that's, I think that's why, for me, what you're doing, Thelma, just to kind of flip it, but the idea of what the Studio Museum is doing, this idea of entropy of black spaces within the context of our environments, no matter how it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter if they evolve and they shift, but that we are actually contributing to that production creates a kind of extraordinary deepening of the memory, and also the kind of the uprightness of the citizen within the place to feel that they are, part of something that is not just, and they're not just part of a background or a sort of, or the kind of the part of the system that's being used to prop another place.
Yeah, right.
To be blunt about it.
Right.
We're not just the immigrants sitting around to be used. We are the citizens of.
Yeah. And even when you started out by thanking Antoine, for putting this together and the meaning of this, I mean, think about this, right? I mean, here we are, we're sitting in Gagosian, in the context of an exhibition that's called Social Works.
That's right.
I mean, what does that say about this space and the place that we exist in sense of culture, in the art world and culture? What does that say? I mean, I think it's going to have significant value as we try to understand how we're moving through these, the fluidity of how things transform.
Yeah. Rick, can you talk a little bit about, because in the formation of this exhibition, there's also an examination of ideas of social practice. And I think that, when we think of social practice in its sort of art conceptual definition, it often is sometimes divested, right, from actual social practice. And your work has stood as a real example of what social practice means when understood through these various lenses, right? The lens of a conceptual art practice hitting up against, what's true economic development, community re-engagement, reinvestment. So can you talk about your path to a social practice and how you defined that?
Yeah, that's it's an interesting question for me because, I have to say that it's been a growing process for me because part of the reason getting into social practice, or I was more informed by Joseph Boy's idea of social sculpture, but the whole idea was to try to figure out how you can merge this notion of the symbolic and poetic meaning with practical kinds of things in the world. But one of the things I find with social practice work is that the practical applications of things is so rigorous and hard. It's hard stuff, right? I mean, you're talking about gentrification. I mean, this has been happening forever, and how do you push back in that context? So it's really hard.
But can you specifically just describe your original idea for Project Row House for our audience that might not know?
No.
Yeah.
And when you started?
Yeah, back in 1993. Well, the idea was that, if we have communities that, that are struggling, and we're artists and we're creative, can we apply that in some way? Can we apply our creativity to that context and kind of elevate it in a way that address the practical needs and, the poetic things as art? But so in that context, it was just really, and I remember back in the day, the thing about social practice for me is that you have to brush up against people that are not coming at it from the poetic side, people that are coming at it from the practical side, right? And so I remember very clearly there was at that time, she was 87 years old. She lived in the back of these old rundown houses and stuff, and we were poking around doing stuff, and her name was Miss Courtney. I remember one day she came out with a gun at us at first, to kind of run us off because she thought we were doing something that was mischievous. But then later when she accepted us, she came back and she says, well, if you want to do something, just clean this shit up. It's like okay. So there, you get smacked with the kind of the practical things that is valuable for people, right? And that's, so I fully embrace that. But then from the art side, and it's like, oh, now you have this practical stuff. How do you layer in something that is poetic and symbolic? And a lot of what I found that to be really is just, finding the histories of things.
That's right.
And telling it in a, telling the history. There's so much poetry in the experience of Black people. There's so much. And you take these little shotgun houses that are falling down, that's, talked about as the worst place in the neighborhood, right? But if you can, first of all, like Miss Courtney said, clean this shit up, right? And then you can start telling the story of the histories of how it moved from the architecture type, moved from West Africa into the U.S. and all the influence. Yeah, all that stuff becomes. Then all of a sudden you've got this higher level of meaning to something that basically was a throwaway. And
can I just say that it was? I remember when I first saw Project Row House and how profoundly influential it was, because what it did was to affirm a value away from the systemic kind of value that is kind of given to, ideas of rich or poor, or more valuable and less valuable places. Because with that move, I felt you sort of it was like a magic trick or somehow. You sort of, here was this thing which any developer would want to tear down, any city would say clear away. Yeah. And you sort of elevated into social sculpture.
Yeah.
They became social sculptures, and they suddenly had a kind of sort of aura that meant you couldn't touch them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I remember as a young architect thinking, my God, I don't even know how you did this, but it was deeply influential for me.
Yeah.
Deeply influential.
Yeah.
In making me realize the power of, being able to kind of make, for what I say you did is that you made Black space conscious. You made it come into consciousness. Yeah. It was subconscious and just used, and you brought it into a sort of, right into the light. As it were. And it was just, anyway.
Yeah, and that, yeah, thank you for that, because that was really, that's kind of the point to me about social practice.
Right.
A lot of it is like, just kind of merging the creative resources that we have with these practical, crazy, messy things that are happening, layering it, and making those things much more than like the spatial kinds of ways we experience them, but in a more place way, which incorporates its history and all the other kinds of social aspects that go into it. To me, that's where social practice gets its value and its meaning.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate that as a way to think about what you have done, but also for me, putting in the context of the institution making that you made, because that's the other thing that it shifted. And just, as we were before beginning this formal conversation, having the chance to kind of see you standing next to Linda Goodbryant and realizing her Just Above Midtown, your Project Row House, basically are the DNA which created so many of the institutions and organizations that some of us have the privilege to now run, or that have been created, some represented in this exhibition.
Yeah.
Maureen Halsey's project, Titus's, Next Haven, Theaster's, Rebuild, but what Project Row House and Just Above Midtown, really proposed was a complete reevaluation of what it meant to create autonomous institutions with values that were rooted, sort of deeply, but had an expansive view. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, and it's so great. It was so great. You caught me at that moment where I was just really, just all into this notion. I'm talking to Linda because I've known of her but never had a chance to speak with her. And it's so great to see how people are doing these incredible things all over. And I just, one of the things that she was saying, that just reminds me so true about so much art and stuff, that it's like, it's like you were saying about like magic, whatever, but it is these impossible things, How is she doing these gardens here in New York City? It's impossible.
Right. Project Eats, yet another example.
So it's like it's magic or something that's happening there, and so it's wonderful.
Yeah. David, I think, and this is going to be for both of you, because I also feel that in thinking about all of the work in this exhibition, it sits, of course, within this concept of what this sort of idea of space, Black space, social practice, social works can be. But there also seems to be a way in which all of these works touch on ideas of memory, which for me in this moment, when I think of memory, I also think of memorials. So in some ways, Rick, what you've created is something about memory, but also about memorial. And David, it feels deeply that informs kind of the space which you work from. So can you talk about the idea of memory and or memorial?
Yeah. Well, for me, with these works and other works that I'll be working on in the future, is because, social practice works, they're, ephemeral, or they're kind of always moving. And so, you have to think about how you archive, how do you, create some longevity of those works that may go beyond, because some projects don't, they're not intended to go on forever. So what happens when they are not there? How do you maintain them? And so, this idea of doing the Black Wall Street journey paintings was this way of like, how do I take this moment in time of the centennial and build some work around this idea that will just be around. It'll be in collections or exhibitions or whatever that will allow that work to live in a way of kind of in my mind, playing a part to getting to beyond the centennial to the bicentennial.
That's right.
I mean, because this is a part of the history that shouldn't be forgotten.
That's right.
And I think that's that kind of, it is memorial making in a sense.
Yeah.
And of course, David's thing. I mean, I'm still the earth. I'm so because I'm thinking about that southern earth too, with the red dirt. In fact, that painting over there, that painting, that was like, it started out with this notion of this red clay, and that's where that color came from, because I was thinking about our conversation about Tulsa and and that dirt down there, it's like it gets red, and so But yeah, so
Iron oxide.
you know. So anyway,
Well, that's just giving it a whole other meaning. Wild. No, I think memory and memorials are, for me in my work, twins that are just inseparable. You know, from, you know, I mean, the Smithsonian was one. You know, I mean, it's.
Say more, David. I mean, it feels like memory and memorial were very embedded in your sense of the architecture of the National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Yeah, the brief was to make a museum, but in my mind, it was to create a trigger memory to pull you back into a deeper history and to really create a sort of space that would honor the ancestors as well as future generations at the same time. So it's a memorial into the future and a memorial of the past at the same time. And you know, I've found a huge amount of confidence in my practice as a creative person, finally understanding that these two elements are really the core of what drives my creativity. That in a way I find resolution in the way in which I make work, the moment when I can stop, when I sense that duality or that tension somehow being brought into play. So it's really amazing to hear you talk about it in terms of painting, because you know, traditionally I've never heard it talked about within painting, so that was kind of profound to hear it. To use the centennial as a kind of way to make a body of paintings, as a way to make you know, it's actually, this should be like a work in one space now. Now that you said that,
Right.
It's like a chamber that should be like a temple. Another discussion.
we'll continue.
But yeah, I think that, you know, I think that for me, in a way, that has always been the issue at the heart of the project, is that I've never felt that I was just free to just make do. Because I felt a sort of gaze upon everything that I was making that was so loaded with issues to deal with. Everything. Every time I constructed, I had to confront all these issues in a way. Not just from the outside, but also within myself. You know, that each act, you know, might be the last act. You know, who knows if I will get another opportunity. And so what does each act mean? And in a way, it has been the foundation of this sort of work. And sometimes people have misunderstood some of my intentionality with a certain kind of rigor of wanting to be absolute with every single thing. People are like, what the hell is he doing? It's just this. I'm like, no, this little thing could be it. And we need to just focus. And so that's always a kind of thing. And it's sort of, in a way, that's also the thing that's sort of, it's what I call it's the fear in a positive way that is constantly driving my creativity about the preciousness of the opportunity of making things that really are dealing with black space and black lives, or just making a catalog that can be a catalog for a black creative to sort of really finally say, I have a kind of, you know, relational kind of, you know, agency with this work, even though it's not my own work.
Right.
But I can actually confidently mine it.
Right.
You know.
Right.
Even though it's not what I'm, you know, literally interested in, but I can confidently mine it because finally there's a body that exists out there. So in a way, you know, at the same time of making the memorial is also the making of the archive at the same time.
Yes.
For me. So the three are the kind of the three games of this move.
Right.
Is you know, how you know, the practice isn't simply just practice. It's those three things at the same time.
Yeah.
Memory operating as even as fiction. I'm totally fine with the black fantasy. In fact, it's the most fabulous. It's like so profoundly fabulous. So in a way, but the memory is about that, since there's not much. So fantasy is operative, but memory also as a kind of dive into history, and then memorial as a kind of entropy within this moment now, and archive as a projection of the future.
Wow. Nice. I love that projection of the future, and how do we, you know, and I'm concerned about that in terms of how do we, you know, what kind of information do we have to project into the future? And, you know, and part of this Black Wall Street journey project is associated with a project that I'm doing in Chicago that's kind of exploring this notion of like, black wealth or whatever. And it's amazing. I've been researching this for the last 2 years, and maybe once a week or so, I go to Google and I just Google black wealth, black prosperity. I try to use different ways of doing it. And you can never come up with anything other than how much wealth we don't have. It's just it's about the wealth gap, right? And it just recently though, something kind of hit me that the problem that we have when we're kind of trying to explore this is that everybody looks at black wealth in comparison to white wealth, right? We don't look at it relative to where we are, right? And how much have we moved or how much have we lost, whatever, within where we are, right? And that's what, and so we don't have, we don't have opportunities to celebrate who we are because we're looking at it in relation to something that is impossible.
Well, we're existing often in a corrective, right, to the way these narratives have been written. And I think so much of what, for me, why art is so important is because it provides us with those possibilities for a kind of reimagining of narratives. Often people say our history is lost. It's not lost, right? Our history is often held very deeply within us. It's one of the reasons I am so obsessed with this idea of place, right? Because, black people hold place deeply. I live and work in Harlem now in the very same neighborhood where my father was born in 1926 and had a relationship through his whole life until his passing. But the Harlem that he held with him all through my childhood was one that was 30 years old, but still profound. Right? Still profound.
That's right.
And still, he saw it as you walk through the street. So when you think about, when I think about gentrification, I understand, I often say it's why I love Harlem, because people talk about what it was and what it will be.
That's right.
It's always this, what was there, and fixing the present becomes so hard. So as we only have a few more moments together, though I could talk to both of you all afternoon, I would love for you all, given again the real powerful brief of this exhibition, to talk about the future. And what the possibility is through art making, place or space making, or any combination of that, to imagine into a future of black life, of black space, of the ways in which we understand that intellectually, emotionally, psychically, spiritually, politically.
Well, future. I mean, I can't help but go back to what I was just saying about the future has to be, we have to really think about how we imagine black space and place from a perspective that's relative to who we are, where we are, and where we want to go, as opposed to comparing it to other places. And I don't know how that's going to, play out and manifest itself, but I will say this. I think that, being an artist, to me, it's, I guess being an artist has always been an exciting thing to be, right? Because society's always dealing with these, kinds of issues. But I think particularly at this point in time when, the Black Lives Matter movement, with the circumstances of COVID and George Floyd's murder, it just opened up this opportunity for us to really create meaningful conversation and reshaping how we talk about, what the Black experience is and what Black space and place is. And I think, artists have we're in a great position to kind of lead that conversation. And that's what I'm hopeful about that.
What would your charge to, say, young artists be, Rick? You're someone who chose a path as an emerging artist that sort of rooted you in your own practice, but in this commitment to ideas of community. What would you say, given the last 15 months of the world, right? Which only echo, right?
Yeah.
Because we're standing in front of paintings about,
Yeah.
100 years ago. But what would you say to emerging artists now about their potential or possibility?
Yeah, I guess I would start by looking back at what I've said to myself, 30 years ago, what I would have probably have done differently, is to really, be, a bit freer in my thinking, in my capacity to engage. I mean, I understand that the work that I was doing required a certain kind of focus and intensity, and it produced some interesting work, right? But I also think that it was unnecessarily kind of, restrain myself, and I think that, I would say to younger artists, find that thing that you're passionate about and really, kind of push it, because that's where we're going to get the movement. But don't, restrain yourself from really allowing yourself to be that full creative being that you are.
Right. Thank you. David, future thoughts.
Good gosh, yeah. I just think, I always think of it like, I think jazz entering the sort of, the music world, and it never ever being the same again. and I just think that what I would call black architecture, or architecture from a black lens, is like that moment for the cities of the world. It is, I think that the perspective is so profoundly different. It's, the more I research it, and I'm doing a lot of sort of research into it, that the sort of built environment is a much more ritualistic, symbolic, powerful space, and it's not a representational space. It's much more about the creation of that, and I think that I just think I can see in my mind's eye how that will kind of beautifully proliferate and pollinate the world more profoundly in terms of really moving, I think, architecture from, and this is just a pronouncement, I could be totally wrong, but moving architecture from a kind of commodity and a rationale from a language into a kind of a certain kind of spirituality, a certain kind of spirituality, as kind of an essence of itself. And I just think that is what I think architecture in the beginning of the 21st century, in the kind of, we talked about the kind of social reconstruction that's happening right now, and it's happening all over the world. It's this idea of searching for, are we just stuff? And why are we on this planet?
Right.
And I think that the architecture, for me, of the black experience really has an answer in that. I deeply believe it. And so I think that I think it's an incredible time to understand this. And if what we're saying is maybe true, it'd be an incredible future.
Absolutely. And I believe it too.
I do too. I believe, David, that you've sort of framed this, right? Black art, we could say black culture as a whole,
basically.
have the answers.
That's right.
And that's what is the possibility to unlock. And I think in this exhibition, all of these practices sort of allow us, right, the chance, this open lens to see possibility and power through the different voices of both of your work, but all of the works included here. So I really want to thank you both for the opportunity to have this conversation about your work and to do it in the context of so many other artists' works that are really creating for us new worlds and new visions. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I just wanted to say thank you to David, Rick, and Thelma for a conversation about space making and place and social practice. And also thank you for joining us today. Again, I know schedules are busy, so thanks for spending an hour with us. We also hope that you will come tomorrow to the opening of the exhibition at Gagosian. It's from 4 to 8 at 555 West 24th Street. Thank you.